There are some nights that refuse to let you forget them. They burrow deep into the marrow of your bones and nest there like something cold and patient, waiting for the moment you close your eyes so they can replay themselves in perfect, agonizing detail. For Marcus Webb, every night had become one of those nights ever since the calls from Hollow Creek began. Marcus had worked as a dispatcher for the Bryan County Emergency Services for 11 years. 11 years of car accidents on frozen highways, domestic disputes that turned bloody, and the occasional heart attack that ended in either a saved life or a family shattered by loss. He had heard people take their last breaths through the static of a phone line. He had talked teenagers down from bridges and guided panicked mothers through delivering their own babies on kitchen floors. Nothing rattled him anymore. That was what he told himself. That was the lie he had lived comfortably inside until the night of October 14th. The call came in at exactly 3:17 in the morning. Marcus remembered the time because he had just glanced at the clock, counting down the hours until his shift ended and he could return to his empty apartment and the dreamless sleep that came with exhaustion. The line crackled with static, more than usual for a rural area where cell service was already unreliable. Through the interference, a voice emerged. It belonged to a woman, elderly by the tremor in her words, and she was crying. She said her name was Edna Marsh. She said she was calling from Hollow Creek. She said the lights had come back and people were walking into the fields again and please someone had to help them before it was too late. Marcus ran the name through the system. Hollow Creek returned 0 results. He checked the county maps spread across his desk, the ones he had memorized years ago when he first started the job. There was no Hollow Creek. Not in Bryan County. Not in any of the surrounding counties. He asked the woman for a street address, for cross streets, for any landmark that might help him locate her. She gave him an address on Millbrook Road. Millbrook Road did exist, but it was nothing more than an abandoned stretch of cracked asphalt that cut through empty farmland and ended at a condemned grain silo that hadn't been operational since the 70s. He dispatched a unit anyway. Deputy Howard Chin volunteered to check it out, probably grateful for something to break the monotony of another quiet night. Marcus stayed on the line with the woman, listening to her describe what she was seeing through her window. She spoke of lights descending from the sky, not like aircraft or helicopters, but slow and deliberate, pulsing with colors that she said hurt to look at directly. She spoke of her neighbors leaving their homes in their nightclothes, walking barefoot through the frost-covered grass toward the fields where the lights touched down. She spoke of her husband, Earl, who had gotten out of bed without saying a word and walked out the front door, and she was too scared to follow him, too scared to do anything but call for help. Deputy Chin reported in 20 minutes later. He had driven the entire length of Millbrook Road. There was nothing there. No houses. No lights. No people. Just empty fields stretching toward the horizon and the skeleton of the old grain silo standing black against the stars. The line with the woman had gone dead somewhere during Chen's report. Marcus tried calling back, but the number that had appeared on his screen no longer worked. The system couldn't even identify what carrier it belonged to. He logged the call as a possible prank and tried to forget about it. But forgetting became impossible when the calls kept coming. They came every night, always between 3 and 4 in the morning, always from Hollow Creek, always from people whose names existed nowhere in any database Marcus could access. A man named Bernard Polk called to report that his son had walked into the fields 3 days ago and hadn't come back, and when Bernard tried to follow his son's footprints in the mud, they simply stopped in the middle of an open stretch of land as if the boy had been lifted straight up into the sky. A teenage girl named Catherine called in hysterics, saying that her parents were standing in the backyard staring up at something she couldn't see, and they wouldn't respond when she screamed at them, and their eyes had gone completely white. A child, no older than 6 or 7 by the sound of his voice, called to say that everyone in his house was asleep but they wouldn't wake up, and there was something tall standing at the end of his bed, and it didn't have a face. Every time, Marcus dispatched units to Millbrook Road. Every time they found nothing. The other dispatchers started to notice. They began checking the logs, listening to the recordings, and exchanging uneasy glances across the room. Someone suggested that it was an elaborate hoax, maybe some bored kids with a signal scrambler and too much time on their hands. But the voices on those calls were too raw, too desperate, too real to be performances. And there was something else, something that Marcus noticed only after listening to the recordings back-to-back in chronological order. The voices were aging. The first call from Edna Marsh had been the voice of a woman in her 70s or 80s. 3 calls later, a woman who also identified herself as Edna Marsh called again, but this time she sounded younger, perhaps in her 50s, and she was describing events that seemed to have happened before the previous calls, speaking of the lights as if they were appearing for the first time, as if she had never called before. The same pattern repeated with other callers. Bernard Polk called 6 times over the span of 2 weeks, and each time his voice grew younger, his memories reaching further back in time, until the final call where he sounded like a man in his 20s calling about his father walking into the fields instead of his son. Marcus pulled missing persons records for Bryan County going back as far as the archives allowed. He found a Bernard Polk who had disappeared in 1953, an Edna Marsh who had vanished in 1947, a Catherine whose last name matched a family that had been reported missing in 1961, all 5 members gone without a trace, their farmhouse found empty with dinner still on the table and the radio still playing. All of them had lived on or near Millbrook Road. Marcus became obsessed. He spent his off hours driving out to that empty stretch of highway, walking through the fields with a flashlight, looking for any evidence that a town had once existed there. He found nothing but soil and weeds and the occasional rusted piece of farm equipment half buried in the earth. But sometimes, when the wind died down and the night grew perfectly still, he could swear he heard something in the distance. Voices maybe. Hundreds of them. Whispering. His supervisor threatened to put him on administrative leave if he didn't get himself together. His ex-wife called to tell him that their daughter had asked why Daddy sounded so scared on the phone during their last conversation. His doctor prescribed sleeping pills that he never took because sleep had become something he dreaded. The dreams had started, and in the dreams he was walking through fields of black grass under a sky filled with lights that pulsed in colors he had no names for, and he was not alone. The final call came on the night of November 2nd. Marcus was alone in the dispatch center, covering for a colleague who had called in sick. The clock read 3:17, the exact same time as the first call. The line crackled. Static poured through the speakers like white noise from a dead television. And then a voice emerged. It was his own voice. The man on the other end of the line identified himself as Marcus Webb. He said he was calling from Hollow Creek. He said he had made a mistake, that he had driven out to Millbrook Road one final time looking for answers, and he had found them, and now he understood everything. He said the lights were beautiful up close, that they sang in frequencies that rearranged your thoughts into patterns that finally made sense. He said it didn't hurt when you walked into the fields. He said it felt like coming home. And then he begged himself not to answer the next call. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, listening to his own voice dissolve into static. The line went dead. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the pounding of his own heart. He quit his job the next morning. He moved out of Bryan County within the week, relocating to a city 3 states away where the lights of skyscrapers drowned out the stars and the noise of traffic ensured he would never experience true silence again. He told himself he was safe. He told himself that distance mattered, that whatever had been calling from Hollow Creek couldn't reach him here. But sometimes, late at night, when the city grows quiet for just a moment, his phone buzzes with an incoming call from a number the system cannot identify. He never answers. He has trained himself to let it ring until it stops, to shove the phone under a pillow and turn up the television and pretend he cannot hear the faint sound of static bleeding through. He knows that one night his discipline will fail him. One night the curiosity will become unbearable and he will answer. And when he does, he already knows whose voice will be waiting on the other end. Some places do not exist on any map because they are not places at all. They are doors. And once you hear them calling, once you know they are there, you have already stepped closer to the threshold than you ever should have been. Marcus Webb knows this now. He knows it every time his phone rings in the dead of night, every time the static whispers through his dreams, every time he catches himself staring at the sky and wondering what those lights might look like up close. The calls from Hollow Creek have stopped for now. But Marcus understands something that keeps him awake more than any nightmare ever could. The calls were never meant to summon help. They were meant to summon him. And somewhere out there, in a town that exists between heartbeats and radio frequencies, something is still waiting for him to come home. If this story sent chills down your spine, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and join our community of horror enthusiasts who appreciate tales that linger long after the screen goes dark. Drop a comment below sharing your own unexplainable experiences, because sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that really happened. Like this video if you felt the dread and share it with someone brave enough to listen. Until next time, keep your phone close and be careful which calls you choose to answer.